Welcome to Silent Chronicler. Tonight's Calm Chronicle will take you deep into one of the world's most heavily guarded prisons, where silence echoes louder than screams. You're not a visitor here, you wake up inside. If you're staying with me tonight, leave a like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Let's enjoy the rest of this night together. And so, without sound or memory, without warning or transition, you begin to surface, slowly and without protest, not into the comfort of morning light or the hush of familiar surroundings, but into something heavier, something that does not greet you, but instead holds you still, as if the space itself is trying to decide whether it wishes to release you from the grip of unconsciousness or leave you suspended there, half formed in thought and breath, among walls that do not speak but still know your name. Your eyes, though open now, find no light waiting for them, no outline of window or door, no shape to comfort your vision. Only shadow, only the deep and reluctant breath of a room that does not move, does not blink, does not welcome. Beneath you there is stone, though at first it feels like nothing more than pressure and cold. A quiet weight pressing upward through your spine and shoulders. A memory of gravity made harsher by the absence of softness. It is not cruel in its touch, only firm, like the forgotten floors of forgotten places, where footsteps no longer mean arrival but only continuation. And as your hand drifts carefully across that surface, the dampness that coats it confirms what you already know, but have not yet admitted. This place breathes not air but condensation and rust, and the walls have long since learned to sweat their sorrow in silence. You breathe, not deeply, but with care, as though each breath must first ask permission, and the air you pull in is thick with stillness, not dusty, not stale, but unused, the kind of air that waits, that listens, that has memorized the rhythm of every inhale that has ever passed through it and finds yours unfamiliar. And layered into that breath behind the metallic tang of oxidized steel and the bitter trace of chemical sterility is something older, something human, like the ghost of sweat left by 1,000 palms on cold rails, the faint echo of a shout that was never quite loud enough to escape. You try to sit up, not out of urgency but necessity, because lying here feels less like rest and more like surrender. And though your body protests, not with pain but with stiffness, it compiles slowly, carefully, as if rediscovering itself. And as you rise, you do not feel liberated but noticed, as though the room has taken note of your motion and filed it somewhere deep within its concrete memory, alongside all the others who have moved in this exact way, beneath this exact ceiling, with the same unspoken question clouding the edges of their mind. Where am I? And why? There is no answer, not yet. Only the sound of water, a slow, distant dripping, so steady and unchanging, it might be part of the structure itself, an architectural heartbeat. And somewhere beyond that, far enough to be uncertain, but near enough to be felt, the echo of footsteps, deliberate, heavy, measured not in urgency but in authority. And as those steps fade, as the silence reasserts itself like fog rolling back in over still water, you realize that you have not entered a place, you have been absorbed by it, and it is in no hurry to let you go. You stand now not as someone who has risen in defiance or hope, but as a figure slowly lifted by invisible strings, not pulled by urgency or command, but by a gravity unique to places like this, where everything that moves does so at the will of systems older than memory and colder than thought. And you do not know whether you are being summoned or simply retrieved. But either way, the motion has begun, and resistance feels as irrelevant as identity. The light outside the open door, flat, fluorescent, humming with artificial calm, spills across your bare feet like a distant tide. And with it comes a presence, not loud, not cruel, simply there. A man whose face is more shadow than expression, whose posture conveys neither menace nor mercy, but rather the bone-deep rhythm of someone who, no longer, needs to question anything, who lives entirely inside the muscle memory of duty. And when he gestures, it is not with haste or irritation, but with the quiet precision of someone enacting a ceremony repeated too many times to recall the first. And so you move. Your first step into the hallway is not marked by fear or resistance, but by a strange stillness inside your body, the kind that comes not from peace, but from the overwhelming absence of choice, and as your foot meets the polished concrete. Cooler and smoother than the cell floor, but no less sterile, the sound it makes is too soft to echo, too respectful to disrupt the weighted silence of the corridor. And already you are aware that you are entering a space not defined by walls or rules, but by observation. A space that watches as you move, that takes note not of your name or story, but of the angles of your movement, the cadence of your breath, the ways in which you yield to direction without needing to be told. The man walks ahead, and you follow, not because he forces you, but because everything in this place conspires to remove the idea that there is another option. And as you walk, the corridor stretches forward, long and unbroken, lit by overhead panels that hum with a frequency just low enough to dissolve thought. And the further you go, the more the environment begins to erase itself. The walls become indistinct. The doors begin to blur together. The lights repeat so rhythmically that time ceases to feel like a progression and instead becomes a loop, a constant white thread pulling you forward through a tapestry of engineered sameness. You try to count the doors, the paces, the flickers of light. But the pattern resists interpretation, designed not to orient but to disorient, and as you walk, you begin to feel the soft tug of unreality at the edges of your perception, as though the hallway is not a physical space but a concept you are being slowly drawn into, a ritual passage where distance means nothing and purpose is measured not in direction but in submission. The man ahead of you never speaks, never slows, never looks back. And yet you are certain he is aware of you in the way the ocean is aware of every pebble on its floor. Not individually, but wholly, without emotion and without exception. There are other figures in the corridor, shadowy, fleeting glimpses behind small panes of reinforced glass, or seated against walls with knees drawn to chests and heads bowed, not in thought, but in the surrender of motion. And some of them watch you, but none react, and you feel not fear from their gaze, but something heavier. The quiet calculation of those who have already been folded into this world, who are watching you, not as a threat or curiosity, but as a reflection of something they once were and no longer recognize. You are not a novelty to them, but a confirmation, another link in the chain, another breath passing through the lungs of a system that has long since forgotten how to speak except through repetition. As you continue, the silence deepens, not in volume, but in texture, thickening around you like fog that listens, that absorbs every scuff of your bare souls and every inhale. You did not mean to make so loud, and somewhere far off, a place you will not reach, a part of the building you will not know. There is a sound like a gate sliding shut, long and metallic, echoing through layers of concrete and memory. And though you do not flinch, your body records it, adds it to the list of things it will carry long after it forgets your name. Eventually, though time no longer has edges here, you arrive. The hallway ends not with a door, but with a pause, a moment where the man ahead stops and the silence leans forward, and when he raises his hand again, no different than before. It is not to invite you, but to place you, to show you where you belong now. And the door to your new cell opens not with drama, but with inevitability. The soft hiss of pressured air, the low click of an automated lock, and the slow swing of metal yielding, not because it was asked, but because it was designed to. And as you cross the threshold, you notice everything and nothing at once. The room is small, yes, but not cramped, just efficient, engineered to provide what is necessary and nothing more. A cot without a mattress, a sink without warmth, a toilet without shame, and a ceiling that seems to lean inward as though curious about your presence, but unwilling to get involved. And you do not pause, because pausing would imply choice, and you no longer feel like someone who makes choices. And so you enter. You sit, and you wait for the door to close. It does. Not loudly, not slowly, simply, completely. And the silence returns. Not the same silence as before, but one tailored to you now, customized by the shape of your breath, the rhythm of your movement, the specific calibration of your presence in this square of space that will now define the boundaries of your existence. You sit for what feels like hours or moments, it makes no difference, and you notice the echo of your heartbeat in your jaw, the dryness of your tongue against the roof of your mouth, the subtle pressure in your chest that says you have not spoken aloud since you arrived. And perhaps you will not for some time, and perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the silence is not merely environmental but architectural. Something built into the design of the facility, not to contain your body, but to quiet your voice, to flatten your spirit until the only sound that matters is the one the building makes when it breathes. There is no window, only a vent, high and small and humming with the slow circulation of air that smells, not of outside but of machinery, as though it has been cleaned of wind and scent and reduced to something purely functional. And even that, you think, is not for you but for the preservation of the system itself, for the continuation of the cycle, for the maintenance of stillness. You lie down, not to sleep, not to rest, but because there is nothing else to do. And because that is what this room is for. Not punishment, not comfort, but containment. And in that word, in containment, you feel the shape of everything this place is, not as an act of aggression, but as a philosophy, as a decision made long ago by people whose faces you will never see, whose voices you will never hear, who believe, perhaps rightly, that silence is the purest form of control. And so you listen, and you wait, and the arrival is complete. You do not ask how long you have been sitting here, nor do you glance toward any clock, for there are no clocks in this place, only rhythms that do not belong to time, but to habit, to routine, to patterns repeated until they lose meaning and become something closer to breathing, involuntary, unconscious, embedded in the architecture of existence itself. And as your eyes trace the edges of the room again and again, as your mind loops through the same few observations that quickly begin to blur together, you begin to feel your own perception shift, not violently, but gently, imperceptibly, like sediment settling at the bottom of a river, until clarity is no longer something you reach for, but something you forget was ever missing. And though the silence is complete, it is not empty. There are layers within it, faint textures that speak not in words but in weight, in the pressure against your eardrums, in the way your own swallow sounds louder than it should, and as you focus on those microcosms of sound, the dry click of your tongue, the soft rub of fabric as you shift, the minute rasp of skin against steel, you realize that this place has taught you something already, something fundamental and unavoidable, that awareness is not about information but about proximity, that in the absence of choice, attention becomes its own kind of freedom. And so, you lean into it, you allow yourself to notice everything. The color of the walls, not gray, not white, but the shade of something deliberately neutral, the kind of tone chosen by design to mute response, to dull interpretation, becomes a kind of landscape, and you begin to imagine it not as a boundary but as a horizon, something that stretches beyond what you see, connecting you to all the other unseen spaces built in this same exact proportion, with these same materials, each containing someone like you, sitting, breathing, becoming smaller by degrees too subtle to measure, but too real to ignore. You close your eyes, not because you are tired, but because sight offers you nothing now, and in the darkness behind your lids, you begin to feel the full shape of your body again, the curve of your back against the cot, the warmth gathering in the pit of your stomach, the slight tremor in your fingers that you hadn't noticed until now, and you understand, without needing to name it, that the arrival has not ended, it is still happening. It is still absorbing you, pulling you in cell by cell, breath by breath, not through force, but through acceptance. And that is perhaps the most frightening thing of all. Not the metal, not the rules, not the guards, not even the quiet, but the realization that your resistance has already begun to dissolve, that somewhere between waking on the floor and sitting now in the hush of your new confinement, you have started to agree. Not out loud, not with words, but in the soft folding in of the self that happens when adaptation is the only way to breathe without breaking. Outside your door, the corridor remains unchanged, silent, unwitnessed. But in your mind, you begin to build it anew, floor by floor, cell by cell, assembling a mental map not out of fact but of sensation, of intuition, of guesswork born from patterns. The footstep that passed 10 minutes ago, maybe 15, maybe longer. The light that flickered twice and then not again. The whisper of air that moved differently a moment before the door opened. And slowly, you are creating a version of this place within you. A mirror of the physical structure built not from steel and concrete but from feeling. From the small things you were never told but already know. And now, without trying, you begin to listen for things that are not there. You imagine a voice, your own, perhaps, or someone else's, just beyond the wall, speaking not in words but in rhythm. Something low, something soft, something steady. You imagine the shift of a guard's weight from one foot to another. The muted clink of keys hanging from a belt. You imagine the slow blink of surveillance cameras in rooms you will never see. The blinking red lights that watch and record but do not interpret. You imagine the hum of a world beyond the walls. Not the world you left. That one has already faded. But a new world, made of corridors and systems and checklists and protocols. A world whose heartbeat is measured not in time, but in movement. The opening of a door, the passing of a tray, the locking of a latch. And so, when you lie down again, this time fully, letting your head touch the thin pillow, your arms fall to either side, you are not preparing for sleep, you are positioning yourself for stillness, for continuation, for the next phase of something that has no phases, no names, only rooms. The light remains the same, the silence deepens. And in that silence, your arrival is finally complete. The light comes not with the rising of the sun, but with the mechanical flicker of overhead fluorescence, a pale and ghostly illumination that does not warm or invite, but merely signals a transition in the architecture's rhythm, a shift from one state of waiting to another. And when it happens, when that light stirs awake above your eyelids, it does not ask you to rise. It simply assumes you will. Because in this place, movement does not follow feeling. It follows programming, and your body, long before your thoughts can form into language, has already begun to stir beneath the rough, thin blanket folded at your waist, your legs sliding free from its reluctant weight, your back straightening not in protest but in ritual, the same way the stone beneath you holds its form, not because it must, but because that is what it was made to do. You sit on the edge of your cot, your feet flat against the cold floor that never forgets the night, your hands resting on your knees, and for a moment, a long, slow moment that stretches like the breath before an answer, you simply exist in the stillness of this space, listening to the air shift around you, to the vent high above exhaling its filtered breath, to the whisper of fabric as you adjust your posture. And in this moment, you remember, not your name, not your story, not even your sentence, but the weight of routine pressing down upon you like gravity, like time itself made physical, reshaping your spine, guiding your limbs, reminding you that today is not a new day. It is the continuation of yesterday, copied precisely, measured carefully, made indistinguishable by design. There is no alarm, no call, no barked command to move, only the quiet understanding between you and the structure that houses you, a mutual recognition that motion is expected now, that the stillness of night must make way for the choreography of day. And so you stand, not quickly, not slowly, but with the deliberate rhythm of someone who has performed this act too many times to count. Someone who no longer resists the sequence, but flows within it, who moves not to assert control, but to preserve alignment with something larger, colder, more permanent than the self. The door does not open yet, not immediately. It waits, as if observing your preparation, taking stock of your compliance, and only when your posture matches the invisible expectation carved into this morning's code, does it finally release with a soft mechanical clunk of locks disengaging, the sigh of air being displaced, the subtle shiver of a system granting you the illusion of choice, and then it slides open, not as a gesture of welcome, but as a continuation of protocol, as the next beat in a drumless rhythm that reverberates through every corridor, every hallway, every identical chamber in this place. You step out. The hallway is already alive, not with voices, not with noise, but with motion. Silent figures emerging from silent rooms, each one like you, each shaped by the same silence, molded by the same repetitions. Eyes forward, bodies upright, steps synchronized not by command but by a deeper alignment, an internalization of the system's tempo, and as you join them, fall into the stream. You feel yourself dissolving again, not in fear, not in surrender, but in an inevitability, like water accepting its place in the current. The walk to the mess hall is not far, but it feels long, not in distance, but in weight, in the density of presence, in the way every step feels like it has been taken before and will be taken again, not by you alone, but by the echo of you. The many versions of you who have passed down this corridor in the mornings before and will continue long after memory has dulled their footsteps into nothing, and around you others move with the same symmetry, their expressions blank, not because they are numb, but because they have become mirrors for the structure itself, reflective, smooth, untouched by individual story. The room you enter next is wide, but not open. It is enclosed not by walls, but by eyes, by unseen cameras, by the weight of gaze that makes every motion feel accounted for. And in the center of this room stand long metal tables, bolted to the floor, paired with benches that do not welcome the body so much as accept its placement. The air smells faintly of reheated starch and lukewarm protein. And as you approach your place, because it is not your choice, not your seat, only your place for now, you receive your tray with the wordless precision of a worker handing a tool to another, and you carry it not like a meal but like a duty, setting it down before you without expression. The food is not meant to taste, it is meant to function. A slurry of nutrients shaped into solids, textures that do not please but pass, temperatures that hover in the median between warmth and indifference, and you eat not out of hunger, but because it is time to eat, because this is the slot in the day where ingestion occurs, where the body receives its maintenance, and as you chew, as you swallow, you do not notice taste, you notice silence, the chewing of others, the scrape of metal against plastic, the occasional breath held too long and released in a soft sigh. And you realize that this is not a meal. This is communion. Not with people, but with the structure itself. A ritual feeding of the system's blood. You do not speak. No one speaks. Speech is not forbidden, but it is unnecessary, inefficient, extraneous to the function of this hour. And so silence prevails, not as oppression, but as standard. And when the time ends, when the invisible clock within the body of this institution shifts to its next alignment, the trays are gathered, the benches vacated, and the procession continues. Not with resistance, not with fatigue, but with the steady, unbroken rhythm of a system perfectly obeyed. You return to the hallway in the same formation in which you arrived, not by command, not by designation, but by the silent choreography that has been etched into muscle and timing, the kind of coordination that no longer requires consciousness. And as you walk, shoulders aligned with shoulders, steps evenly spaced, gazes set forward, you do not feel like part of a line, but like a component within a mechanism, moving with the ease of something well-maintained, well-oiled, well-controlled. And the corridor, familiar now in its blankness, receives you, not as a new presence, but as a returning element, folding your motion into its breathless exhale. The next space, larger and quieter in a different way, is the yard. Not open sky, not green fields, not sunlight and air, but a courtyard of concrete and containment, ringed by fencing that is more symbolic than defensive, as the walls surrounding the perimeter rise so high that escape feels more theoretical than practical. And the strip of sky visible above is not so much offered as it is tolerated. A narrow ribbon of pale blue that does not belong to you, only to the architecture, as a design feature, a concession to the illusion of light. Here, the men stretch, not to feel alive, not to test their strength, but because the routine includes movement, because stillness must sometimes be replaced with action if the body is to remain usable, if the mind is to remain seated in its place without clawing its way out through the skull. And so arms rise, torsos twist, feet shuffle in patterns that resemble exercise, but carry none of the urgency, none of the drive, only the same meditative obedience that colors everything else here. And as you join, as your own arms extend outward, upward, downward, you feel the ache not of exertion, but of memory. Muscle memory, yes, but also the distant memory of choice, the long-lost sensation of moving because you wanted to, because the air invited you, because your body once belonged to you. And still, no one speaks. The sound here is made up of breath, of rubber soles against a rough ground, of the rustling of synthetic fabric, of the occasional chirp from some bird that lives nearby, outside the walls, unaware of the silence it interrupts. And each sound is registered not with attention, but with acceptance, folded into the larger soundscape of existence without comment. There are guards, yes, always. But they do not yell, do not posture, they watch. Their presence felt more than seen. Their silhouettes visible through glass or behind gates, holding rifles not for use but for symbolism. Because the weapon is not their authority, the space is, the structure is, the silence is. And so you never look at them, not out of fear, but because they are not relevant to your motion, because your behavior does not change in their presence, because nothing changes. Time here does not pass, it settles. You do not measure it in minutes or events, but in transitions, from corridor to cell, from cell to mess hall, from mess hall to yard, and back again, the cycle repeated with such consistency that the distinction between morning and afternoon begins to fray, not violently, but softly, like paper soaked in water, until you begin to suspect that day and night are not opposites here, but reflections, that perhaps the light above your head and the darkness behind your eyes are simply two halves of the same moment, turning slowly inside your mind. When the time for movement ends, it ends without announcement, only by shift. You feel it in the way the others begin to slow, to look not at each other, but toward the exits, to file back into formation not with urgency but with inevitability. And so you follow, your steps folding back into the rhythm, your body returning to its assigned pace, your breath aligning once more with the collective inhale of the system that has swallowed you. You return to your cell. You sit again. The door closes. And in that moment, as the room seals you once more inside its colorless, echoless embrace, you realize that you are neither full nor empty, neither rested nor tired, neither seen nor invisible. You are merely placed precisely where the system means you to be, in the silence it has built for you. Within the cycle, it has constructed not to punish you, but to quiet you. And in that quiet, the day begins again. You sit for a long time, though you do not know how long, because nothing in this place offers time to you in a form you can use. No clocks, no shadows that shift across the wall, no change in light that tells you the world is turning. And so, you come to understand that time is not denied to you. It is simply ignored, like a sound that once mattered and now no longer does. And as you sit, your back pressed lightly to the cool surface behind you, your hands resting on your thighs, your breath slowed to the pace of still water, you begin to feel the minutes not as individual steps but as a slow river, one without current, without source, without mouth, just endless presence. Your body aches in small ways, not sharp pain, but the ache of disuse, of tension that has nowhere to go. And so you stretch your legs slightly, shift your shoulders, tilt your neck one way then the other, and every motion echoes slightly within your bones. a subtle reminder that you are still here, still flesh, still movement, even as the room tries, softly, slowly, to make you otherwise. Sometimes you hear things beyond the walls, not often, not clearly, but enough to remind you that you are not the only one, that other lives unfold in parallel behind these concrete shells, other sets of lungs filling and emptying, other trays being placed and removed, other eyes watching the same flickering strip of sky, and for a moment you feel that connection, not as comfort, but as echo, as resonance, like standing at the edge of a canyon and hearing your own voice return to you changed. You rise again. Not because someone tells you, not because you want to, but because your body knows that this is the time for movement. Because the internal rhythm, the one that has begun to replace your own, tells you it is time to be somewhere else, and just as before, the door responds, opening not with a welcome, but with a statement. The system sees you, the system expects you, the system continues. And so do you. You return to the hallway, identical in every way, yet different now because you know it better. Because your mind has begun to assign meaning to its sameness. The scuff on the wall 3 tiles ahead, the slightly dimmer light above the 4th cell on the left, the tiny shift in temperature when you pass the junction point where 2 ducts meet. And though these differences do not matter, they become yours. They become signposts in a world where direction is illusion and motion is containment disguised as progress. There is another room now, another destination within the cycle. This one dedicated not to sleep, not to food, not to stillness, but to observation. A space filled with metal chairs bolted to the floor, facing forward, lined in rows, all directed toward a screen that displays nothing yet, not because it is broken, but because what it will show does not need to surprise you. And as you sit, as the others sit, as silence folds itself once more around your shoulders like a worn blanket, the screen comes to life. What you see is not entertainment. It is not instruction. It is not even information. It is reinforcement, images and messages that repeat truths you are expected to accept. Slogans rendered in block letters, voices speaking slowly and clearly about order, about dignity, about compliance and peace and internal harmony. And though you do not resist, you also do not absorb, because these messages are not meant to be believed, only to be present, like wallpaper, like ceiling tiles, like the hum of a vent. And as the screen flickers, your eyes begin to drift, not away, but inward. You think, briefly, of a tree. You do not know why. It rises in your mind slowly, its trunk broad and silent, its branches high, unmoving in the air you imagine as still and sunlit, and you see its bark, rough and textured, and the leaves green but soft, and for a moment you are somewhere else, not outside, not free, but far enough from here that your breath feels different, and the silence, instead of surrounding you, comes from within. Then the screen goes dark. The chair is empty. The corridor returns. You return once more to the familiar geometry of your cell, and this time, as the door closes behind you with that same unceremonious finality, that soft mechanical sigh and sterile locking thud, you notice, not the sound itself, but the silence that rushes in behind it, the way it folds around you like something organic, like a tide returning to its own gravitational truth. And in that silence, which is never really silent, but textured with breath and flickering light and memory too faint to name, you lower yourself onto the edge of the cot, not with resignation, not with fatigue, but with the practiced grace of someone who understands that stillness here is not just a pause between motions, but an offering, a ritual gesture to a system that notices everything and acknowledges nothing. You sit with your back straight, your hands resting palms down on your thighs, your eyes tracing the lines where floor meets wall, where wall meets ceiling, where the illusion of space touches the architecture of certainty, and you begin once again to count the motions, not because you need to, but because you can. Because the act of counting has become a language your body understands better than speech. The stretch of each toe inside your state-issued shoes, the slow rising and falling of your chest, the tick of your jaw each time you swallow in the dry, climate-controlled air. And somewhere in the repetition, your mind begins to drift without leaving, to unspool gently like thread from a spool, still attached, still connected, but no longer tightly wound. The next segment of your routine arrives not by schedule, but by sense, by the shift in your own posture that tells you the hour has changed, that it is now time for cleaning, for the rearrangement of the same few objects that cannot move, for the wiping of surfaces that do not gather dirt, for the performance of care in a space that cannot decay. And you rise again, your feet remembering the pattern before your thoughts do. And you move through the actions with the deliberate stillness of a monk. Not because someone is watching, though someone always is, but because the repetition has become prayer, has become structure, has become a kind of temporary truth. You fold your blanket again, not because it has been used, but because it must be folded precisely, perfectly. And you smooth your cot's surface with a flat palm, not because anyone will lie on it, but because flatness is expected. And you rinse your hands beneath the water that runs too cold and too short. And you scrub a basin that no longer needs to be cleaned. And you wipe a shelf that holds nothing. And through each motion, you are not empty, but filled with a kind of clarity that exists only in the absence of choice. A clarity shaped by repetition and rhythm and the small, sharp grace of perfect compliance. You begin to understand that cleanliness here is not about hygiene, it is about rhythm. That order is not the absence of chaos, but its containment, its quiet repackaging into movements that no longer ask questions. And so you move without questioning. And when you finish, you do not pause to admire your work, because admiration implies authorship, and this room, this cot, this blanket, these walls, they do not belong to you. They belong to the rhythm, and you are simply the hands through which it moves. The meal returns again, in the same tray, with the same portions, the same colors and shapes and textures, and you eat not with hunger, but with timing. With the slow, deliberate precision of someone who has learned that to chew evenly is to be safe, that to swallow at the right moment is to remain invisible, and you no longer taste anything except the texture. And even that begins to soften until it, too, is part of the silence. And the scrape of your plastic fork against the tray becomes the only real sound, and even that fades once the tray is removed, once the silence reclaims its place. The lights above you do not change. They flicker sometimes, hum always, and bathe the room in that same lifeless pale, that surgical glow that does not invite sleep, does not welcome wakefulness, only reveals your presence to the walls, and you begin to feel that light not on your skin but beneath it, in your bones, in the back of your eyes, until the shadows of the room begin to cast themselves inward, and you see them not just around you but within you. Long, slow movements of thought that reach across the ceiling of your mind and hang there, unmoving, like threads suspended in amber. There is a moment in each day, though you no longer know which day or which hour, when you hear something different, something distant and low, like a generator pulsing or a hallway door slamming 4 corridors away. And for a second, the rhythm falters, not breaks but flutters. And in that flutter, you feel a version of yourself shift inside your chest. The old self. The one who used to react. Who used to tense at the sound. Who used to think in terms of cause and consequence. But now that version has no place here, no air to breathe, and so it recedes again. And the rhythm resumes, and you return to stillness. You lie down once more, this time not to rest, but to transition, to complete the circuit of the day. And your spine sinks into the cot as though it recognizes its shape there. And your eyes close not because you are tired, but because there is nothing else to see. And your arms rest at your sides because that is where they belong. And you listen to the room, not to the silence, but to the movement within the silence. The soft ticking of your own biology, the slow exhale of the building's mechanical lungs, the whisper of breath that does not belong to you but to the space. And in that harmony, that low hum of things remaining exactly the same, you drift not into sleep but into stillness, into the final shape of the day's routine, And then, without announcement, without fanfare, without even knowing it, the day ends. Not as a point on a line, but as a breath drawn in and never fully released. And when it begins again, you will not notice. You will simply continue, as you have always continued, in rhythm, in silence, in the endless routine that no longer feels like prison, but like the only place where your shape still fits the air. And you go with it. And the more the pattern repeats, the more each motion folds into the one before it and then stretches seamlessly into the one that follows. The more the day begins to lose not only its beginning and end, but its very edges, and soon you cannot say when it started, or when it shifted from one phase to another, or when your limbs began to move without your will guiding them. And the sound of your own breath is no longer a rhythm of life, but the rhythm of the routine itself moving through you, animating your body like a soft, invisible current, guiding a leaf downstream without resistance or question. Because now your will does not act, but follows. And even the idea of following feels too active, too intentional, because this is not obedience, not anymore. It is union. Each trip through the corridor becomes less a journey and more a return to a place that never left you, a folding inward. And as your feet brush the same floor tiles in the same order, passing the same stretch of wall where the paint chips in the same pattern, passing the same door that's always closed, hearing the same buzz from the same light that's always slightly dimmer than the rest, you no longer register them as separate or sequential. Instead, they blur into a single frame, endlessly looping like a reel of film with no break, no edits, just one continuous scene of motion softened by repetition until it is no longer performance but presence. Your hands know the shape of the toothbrush before you reach for it. Not because they remember, but because remembering is no longer necessary. And your jaw opens and closes with mechanical precision, and you do not taste the paste, do not feel the bristles, do not even see the mirror above the sink because it reflects nothing back at you anymore, just light, just color. Just the faint shadow of something shaped like a face but hollowed of history. And when you rinse your mouth, you do not think of cleanliness or decay or health, only of transition. Because this moment, too, is part of the day, part of the flow, part of the scaffolding that holds your awareness in place like beams in a building that has no outside. Sometimes, in the space between stations, in that brief breath between cleaning and walking, between eating and sitting, between being watched and watching yourself, you feel a strange stillness. Not in the room, but in the rhythm itself, as if something in the architecture pauses to regard you, to measure the distance between who you once were and who you are now. And in those moments you feel a faint pressure in your chest, like memory knocking gently from behind a locked door. Not trying to escape, just reminding you it once lived here. And then you blink. And then you move. And then the next part of the day has begun. You begin to speak to yourself in your mind, not because you miss conversation, but because the absence of voice creates a vacuum and nature fills all vacuums. And so thoughts stretch into phrases, into whispers that no longer use words but concepts, sensations, the language of touch and shadow and breath. And sometimes you imagine answers to questions you do not ask. And those answers come from voices that are neither familiar nor strange, just present, like echoes across an open field at night, unseen, unthreatening, always returning to silence before they can finish what they started. The repetition deepens. Your body, now so finely attuned to the pattern, begins to anticipate the rhythm not by seconds or steps, but by sensation. By the slight itch behind your ear that signals the end of sitting, by the pull in your lower back that tells you standing will come soon, by the hunger that no longer rises in your stomach, but in your spine, in your shoulders, as if the body itself is redistributing function to make survival more efficient. And when your hands rise, or your knees bend, or your feet slide forward across the floor, you no longer feel like the actor of those movements, only the witness, the occupant of a body that has long since decided how best to move through this world. The others remain distant. You see them, yes, you pass them, you move beside them, you breathe the same filtered air. but they are like trees in a forest you have stopped mapping. They exist, they sway, they are rooted. But you no longer measure them, no longer ask what they think or feel or want, because none of those things belong here. Because if they ever did, they were left behind in the first few weeks, in the time before silence became more real than speech. And now their eyes move but do not see. Their hands fold and unfold but do not seek. And you realize that you are like them, not because you resemble them, but because you are made of the same rhythm. And this rhythm is no longer something you follow. It is something you are. And when the lights above shift slightly in tone, not enough to call it sunset, only enough to say something has changed, you do not react. You simply understand that it is time to sit again, to return to stillness, to prepare for the next segment of containment, not because someone told you, but because every cell in your body knows, and every cell is aligned. And alignment here is not discipline. It is design. You sit, you wait, you breathe, and the routine continues not as a loop, but as a spiral, deeper and deeper, narrower and narrower, until even the idea of escape becomes so distant it no longer feels like freedom but like noise, a sound too loud to fit inside the soft, symmetrical world that holds you now. And so you remain in that posture, not because it is comfortable, and not because it was chosen, but because it is the final shape that the day has carved you into, the position where gravity presses most evenly through your spine, where breath meets stillness without resistance, where the cot beneath you no longer feels like furniture, but like terrain, and your limbs arrange themselves not with thought, but with precision, an unconscious echo of every previous moment you have sat just like this, in the same light, in the same silence, while outside your door the hallway persists in its mute consistency, and the air flows as it always flows, and the walls stand exactly as they have since you first arrived, unmoved, unchanged, uninterested. You begin to forget that you were ever not here, not in the dramatic sense of amnesia or erasure, but in the way a distant dream fades under morning light, in the way a word repeated too many times loses meaning and becomes only sound. And so, the idea that you once had mornings defined by alarm clocks and steaming coffee, that your body once walked freely through spaces without permission, that you once spoke without counting your own syllables, that idea becomes less a fact and more a story. And even the story begins to feel like it belonged to someone else, or to a character you invented once, in a room full of books and windows and voices, long before this room became your world. Even your name, when you think it, if you think it, feels foreign now, like the name of a stranger you met once at a train station, someone who looked familiar, someone who smiled in the way you think you used to smile, but whose name did not quite fit the sound of your breath, whose syllables felt too wide, too loud, too public to survive in this place. And so the name slips further into the distance, not forgotten, but abandoned, like a coat you leave on a bench because the weight of it is no longer worth the comfort. The room darkens, not in reality, not in light, but in feeling, as if the walls themselves have drawn inward slightly, closing the space between atoms, tightening their embrace around you and your eyes, so long adjusted to the steady, artificial glow, begin to find patterns in the shadows again, shapes and movement and memory surfacing like film negatives, in solution. And the longer you stare, the more the room becomes not a box but a canvas, a place where every glance leaves a mark, where every silence grows branches, where the very air seems to hum with the quiet music of repetition. Sometimes you hum, just once, a single note, not because you mean to, not because it matters, but because there is something in you that still wants to know what you sound like. Something that reaches up from the base of your throat and presses against your tongue and says, I am still here, I am still here, I am still here. And then it fades. And then you are quiet again. And then the next movement begins. And the movement is no longer something you distinguish as separate from stillness, no longer a shift in the sequence, no longer a change you feel or even register, because now the boundaries between beginning and ending have softened into one continuous surface, smooth and without edge, like polished stone beneath your fingertips. And so when your legs uncurl and your feet slide across the cold floor, and your body lifts itself upright in a motion that feels neither voluntary nor imposed, you simply go with it, carried along as though by some invisible belt, moving beneath the soles of your feet. And the hallway receives you again, just as it always has, like a recurring dream whose door never locks. This time there are fewer others. Or maybe they are the same, just spaced differently. Or maybe you are not seeing them at all, only remembering where they should be, because now the world exists more as a map you trace from memory than a space you occupy with certainty. And as you walk, hands at your sides, shoulders squared, gaze forward, you no longer search for markers of the day, for faces or differences or even confirmation. You simply move, like breath in a lung that belongs not to you but to something larger, something slow and patient and made entirely of design. You are taken to a different room, or perhaps the same room arranged in a different order. It has a table, a chair, a wall with nothing on it. You sit because the motion requires it, because your body understands that this is the sitting hour, that now is the time to be watched, to be still, to wait not for a task or a question, but for presence itself to acknowledge that you are doing exactly what is expected. And so you place your hands flat upon the table, fingers aligned, and you stare at the wall that does not move and does not speak. And slowly, the room begins to shrink, not in size, but in need. And the longer you sit, the less of the room you require, until eventually all that is left is you and your breathing, and the sound of the air moving over your lips, and the faint, imagined tick of time folding itself like paper inside your skull. You wonder, not aloud, not even in clear thought, how long you have been here, not in the room, not in the building, but in the rhythm, in the repetition, in the shape of the day that wraps itself around your limbs like a slow, invisible vine. And the answer does not come, because the answer does not exist, not in the form you used to understand. And instead, what comes is the feeling of time without direction, a river without current, a line drawn in a circle until it becomes a spiral, and then a dot, and then nothing. Someone enters the room, maybe, or maybe they are already there. You do not turn your head, you do not blink. You remain as you were taught, as you have practiced, and the presence near you, whether imagined or real, says nothing, does nothing, only exists. And that, you realize, is the point. That existence here is the highest form of compliance. That to be still, to breathe, to remain, is to perform perfectly the ritual of survival. Eventually, you are led away again. The hallway returns. The corridor swells, the cell accepts, and the bed receives your weight as though it has never held anyone else. And as your eyes close once more, not in sleep but in surrender, you feel the day slip beneath you like warm water, silent and complete. And you do not ask whether it will come again, because you know it already has. And when you return once more to that rectangular interior, you no longer think of as a cell, but rather as the central organ of your daily repetition, as the physical shape of the mind that this place has slowly sculpted from the soft clay of your former self. The door does not close behind you so much as it completes the shape of the silence, sealing it, like a breath held deep within the chest of something larger than you, something older, something that does not speak and does not need to, because its language is already in your lungs, already in your spine, already beneath your fingernails where you used to feel the scratch of individuality, now replaced with the smooth, frictionless consistency of pure, quiet adaptation. You do not sit because you want to, nor because you must, but because every cell in your body now recognizes the invisible alignment between posture and time, because there is a correct angle for your knees, a prescribed curvature for your back, a specific way your hands should rest in the hollows of your thighs, that matches the invisible template etched into the molecules of the space around you. And to deviate from that pattern would feel not like rebellion, not like risk, but like a dissonance so deep and vibrational that your entire nervous system would recoil in protest like a tuning fork struck against the wrong surface, wrong, not because it is forbidden, but because it is unharmonized with the system you now live inside. And as you sit, unmoving, with breath that you no longer measure in seconds but in volume, in density, in temperature, with eyes half-lidded not in fatigue but in neutral focus, your perception of space itself begins to undergo another soft collapse, a slow reorganization in which the walls around you are no longer surfaces, no longer boundaries, but fields. Fields of weight, of history, of something dense and invisible pressing back against your awareness at all times. And though you cannot see it, though you cannot name it, you know that this pressure is not imagined, because it is the same pressure you feel when you blink, when you shift your toes inside your shoes, when you press your tongue against the roof of your mouth and feel the weight of silence vibrating behind your teeth like an ancient echo waiting to be released but never quite forming a sound. The minutes pass, not as motion, not as narrative, but as layering, one moment resting perfectly atop the previous one, like dust on a window pane that has not been cleaned in years, no longer questioned, because even the idea of asking has become too loud, too coarse, too shaped by the jagged edges of memory that this place has spent so long sanding away. And when you eventually lie down, not because it is night, not because it is sleep, but because the rhythm has arrived at that segment of its internal circuit, your body does not relax so much as rearrange itself into the configuration required for the next cycle of containment, and you let your arms fall to either side, not with drama, not with weariness, but with the soft precision of someone aligning objects on a shelf, someone folding paper along lines that were creased long before they ever touched them, and your eyes close without needing to be asked because the darkness within your skull now matches the darkness behind the lights, and what once felt like an ending now feels like the continuation of stillness, the deepening of silence, the completion of a shape too complex to ever fully understand, but too familiar to ever truly escape. And as you lie there in that familiar position, not arranged for comfort, not positioned for rest, but aligned with the unspoken geometry of repetition that now governs every motion of your body and every flicker of your mind, you begin to sense, without needing to articulate it, that something within you has begun to stretch, not outward, not toward anything, but inward, deeper, into the cavernous silence of your own interiority, as if the absence of noise and the constancy of stillness has carved open a corridor through your thoughts, long and dark and spiraling. And now you're falling down it slowly, not in fear, not in descent, but in exploration, because the world outside your skull has become too soft, too flattened, too predictable to hold your attention anymore. And so the mind turns inward, seeking variation, seeking edge, seeking the echo of something once alive. You stop remembering what day it is, not because you are forgetful, but because the word day no longer matches any pattern in your life. And even if you tried to hold on to the calendar that once structured your thoughts like scaffolding, it would crumble beneath the weight of sameness, because the light above your head never changes, the meals never change. The steps you take from bed to door and back again follow the same alignment. And so time, no longer measurable in hours or events, becomes emotional, becomes a shifting current of sensation inside your chest. And you begin to categorize not by date or duration, but by how sharply or softly you feel yourself drifting within each segment of the routine. Sometimes you catch yourself staring at the wall for so long that the texture of the concrete begins to ripple, not literally, not physically, but perceptually, as if your eyes are no longer interpreting the surface as stable, as if your brain has decided that without new stimuli it must invent movement, must introduce slight irregularities in shadow and shape to maintain its own structure. And in those moments you wonder, not aloud, not even clearly, whether the wall is changing or whether you are witnessing a collapse of your perception or the wall's decision to respond to your gaze. and the fact that both explanations seem equally possible no longer alarms you, because the distinction between hallucination and adaptation has lost its utility. And you begin to talk to yourself, not in whispers, not in sound, but in full sentences that unspool across the surface of your consciousness like text, scrolling slowly across a screen. Thoughts not of escape or longing, but of things long forgotten. The taste of lemon on your tongue, the way rain feels on skin after the heat, the exact sound of your own voice laughing in a room that echoed, and the memory does not come as image, but as feeling, as vibration. And it is not warm or nostalgic, but distant and mathematical, like reading a poem in a language you once knew, but have not spoken in years. You think in layers now. The outer layer follows the routine. Fold the blanket, align the shoes, sit at the precise angle of expectation, chew exactly 28 times, drink the measured water, walk without sound. The middle layer observes the outer. It notes your compliance, it evaluates your stillness. It wonders whether your reflection is slightly slower today, whether the blinking red light in the corner of the ceiling is blinking at the same rate. And beneath that, far beneath that, there is a third layer, one that no longer has shape or sound or even clear words, one that moves like fog across an empty field, one that occasionally rises through the others and brings with it a memory not of a moment, but of a question, something like who, or before, or if, and then it vanishes again, leaving only the echo of an emotion without origin. You wake up and you're already sitting. You close your eyes and you're already walking. You eat and you do not remember beginning to eat. You finish and you do not remember the last bite. And this, you begin to understand, is not sleepwalking and not dreaming, but something deeper, something the system encourages without ever naming. The full integration of routine into identity. The merging of architecture and anatomy, where the rhythm is not something you follow, but something that has replaced you. And when you try to locate yourself, to say, in the silent speech of the mind, the pronoun echoes without anchor because there is no longer a noun for it to point to. Only action. Only silence. Only stillness. You begin to love the silence. Not as comfort, and not as peace, but as consistency. Because silence never fails you, never confronts you, never asks anything of you except to match its stillness. Because silence is the only sound that never lies. And so you remain. And so the room remains. And the thought continues, endlessly like breath. And within that silence, now deeper and more enveloping than any sleep you have ever remembered, you begin to notice the way your thoughts have slowed. Not from fatigue or numbness, but from adaptation. Like a river that has grown accustomed to the shape of the canyon it runs through. No longer rushing, no longer crashing against the edges, but gliding along the contours of routine until the water becomes indistinguishable from the stone. And you no longer ask yourself what you are thinking, because the thoughts are no longer yours in the sense they once were. They are simply present, drifting through the mind like mist through an open courtyard, never quite forming into language, never quite requiring understanding, only existing, only passing, only being. You begin to understand the shape of silence, not metaphorically, not as a poetic idea, but as a real physical sensation, a pressure that sits behind your sternum, in the soft tissue between your ribs, a space where once you might have felt tension or anxiety or even longing, now filled with something quieter, heavier, more complete. And you realize that it is not the absence of sound that defines silence here, but the absence of need, the absence of reaction, the absence of urgency, the absence of the self's insistence on declaring itself at every turn. And in that absence you find not despair, not emptiness, but something close to peace, though even that word feels too ornate, too embellished, too bound to the idea of comfort. And what you feel is not comfort, but surrender, not to something else, but to the lack of something else. And your dreams, when they come, and they do come, though you no longer know, when they begin or end, are not dreams of places or people or actions, but of states, of floating, of sliding, of unfolding. Sometimes you feel yourself expanding beyond the edges of the bed, of the room, of the building, becoming wider, more diffuse, until you are no longer a body at all but a pattern of vibration, a slow harmonic wave that moves through the structure and into the silence. And sometimes you feel yourself folding inward, into your chest, into your breath, into the space between your eyes, until you are so small that even your thoughts become too large to contain, and they break apart like clouds and wind and leave you staring, not at anything, but through the nothing. The mirror, when you pass it, no longer surprises you with your own reflection, because it no longer feels like a reflection at all, just an image, a visual placeholder for presence, and your face, once a container of expressions, of identity, of memory, is now only a shape, a map of features that do not react unless prompted, and the eyes that look back at you do not ask questions. They only observe, calmly, like the cameras, like the vents, like the lights. And you begin to wonder, not with fear, but with quiet curiosity, if perhaps this is what the walls see when they look at you, if they see only the outline, only the shape, and whether that is all there is left. The guards no longer frighten you, not because they are kind, not because they are fair, but because they are consistent, and consistency in this place is comfort. And the sound of their boots, slow, even, deliberate, has become part of the environment, like the hum of the lights, like the hiss of the air vents, and you begin to register them, not as people, but as pulses in the rhythm. And their gaze, when it sweeps past you, does not burn, does not judge, it simply scans. And when it moves on, it does not leave behind fear, but silence. And you remain where you are, unmoved, unchanged, returned. And so the days unfold, though the word day now feels irrelevant. And you stop thinking of them as units of time and start thinking of them as loops of breath, of posture, of temperature and repetition and stillness, and you stop asking what time it is. Not because you no longer care, but because the answer would have no meaning. What is morning when the light is always the same? What is evening when rest no longer brings relief but only the continuation of quiet? And what is tomorrow when nothing will be different? You forget the date. You forget the month. You forget how old you are, and none of it feels like loss. It feels like simplification. It feels like becoming less so that something deeper can remain. And as the hours, or what your mind still feebly refers to as hours, though it no longer recognizes them as real units of time, stretch and spiral inward, folding upon themselves in a slow and voiceless collapse. You begin to feel as though you are living not across a sequence of events, but within a single extended moment, a moment so long and so dense that it has consumed all others, a moment so wide in scope that you can no longer see its beginning or its end, only the infinite present within which your body continues to exist, repeating gestures not for progress, not for purpose, but because stillness, like all things in this place, has learned to move in circles. You realize with a calmness that once would have horrified you but now simply feels natural, inevitable, appropriate, that you no longer remember the last time you truly waited for something, because waiting implies the anticipation of change. And here, where change does not exist, the very mechanism of expectation begins to rot like a muscle that is never flexed until even hope itself feels like an unnecessary complication, an inefficient emotional artifact of a previous life in which time held variety, in which motion meant movement, in which the future was not a duplicate of the past dressed in new colors, but a place where newness was still possible. You learn to measure the passing of the system not by clocks or sunrises or checklists, but by sensations that no longer register as separate from your nervous system, by the ache in your left knee that blooms precisely when it is time to sit, by the taste of metal in your mouth that precedes the arrival of food that does not taste, by the subtle flicker behind your eyes that always comes just before the door clicks open, And when these signals arrive, you do not question them, you do not test them, you simply comply. Not because you are obedient, but because obedience is no longer a concept, only a reflex, and reflexes are not judged. You have dreams, but they are no longer dreams in the shape of memory or metaphor. They are dreams of sensation, of texture, of rhythm, long stretches of gray without edge, pulses of sound that carry no meaning but still feel full, flashes of colorless light that do not illuminate, but instead seem to subtract from the space around them. And in these dreams there are no faces, no words, no history, only the recurring presence of space itself, sometimes shifting, sometimes constant, sometimes infinite, and you wake from them not confused, not frightened, but simply returned. And the return itself no longer feels significant, because sleep and waking are now just different shades of the same thought. And somewhere in the middle of a walk, from cell to corridor, from corridor to station, from station back again, you catch yourself watching your own hands as they swing at your sides, and for a brief, electric moment, you do not recognize them. Not because they are unfamiliar, but because the act of noticing them has become so rare, so obsolete, that the simple shape of fingers, of nails, of skin catching light feels foreign. And you realize that the body, once a territory you occupied with familiarity and control, is now a vessel, a vehicle for pattern, for structure, for breath and position and ritual, and the fact that you inhabit it has become incidental. And when, from somewhere far off in a direction you cannot name, you hear a door slam, a real sound, abrupt, unscheduled, human, you do not flinch, you do not turn, you do not even assign it meaning. It simply enters the acoustic landscape like an unexpected bird in a distant sky, briefly alive and then gone again, swallowed by the larger field of stillness, and the only thing that lingers is not the sound, but the space it left behind, a brief widening of your awareness that narrows again almost immediately, because curiosity is a luxury, and you are no longer a creature who consumes luxury, only one who circulates within design necessity. And the meals keep arriving, and you keep consuming them, and the process has become so mechanical that you sometimes cannot recall whether you have eaten or are about to, and you have begun to suspect that the nourishment is not truly in the food itself, but in the act of lifting the tray, of sitting in the prescribed posture, of chewing at the prescribed speed. And you begin to imagine that even if the trays were empty, the rhythm of the meal would still nourish you in its own way. Because hunger has long since stopped being a biological impulse and has become instead a mathematical function, an interval in a score you are now performing with the quiet precision of a monk in a religion with no God. You see other prisoners, sometimes in the periphery, sometimes across a silent table, but they are not companions, not even fellow travelers. They are reflections, not of you as you are now, but of what you will continue to become, hollowed out of expression, stripped of excess, perfected in their silence. And when your eyes meet, which happens less and less frequently as the days collapse into each other, there is no recognition, no camaraderie, no resentment, only a kind of neutral observation, like two clouds drifting across the same sky, and acknowledging each other not as entities, but as movements, as presence, as nothing. And in those rare moments when your thoughts, unprompted and uninvited, drift back toward the world before, toward names and streets and seasons and voices, you feel the friction of memory, a rasping texture against the smooth rhythm of your current mind, and you do not pull away, but you do not reach for it either, because reaching is an act of intention, and intention implies desire, and desire implies absence. And here, now, in this place where everything is provided, routine, space, food, silence, time, absence no longer registers, because nothing is present in the first place. And eventually, you begin to notice not how long you've been here, but how long it has been since you last noticed that you were here at all. And as more of these formless, borderless, Intervals pass. Intervals you can no longer call days or nights, but only spaces between repetitions. You begin to notice that your perception has ceased to respond to the external entirely. That the clatter of trays, the rhythmic passing of footsteps, the subtle flickering of the overhead lights have all flattened into background. Not through habituation, but through transformation. Because now you no longer experience the environment as something around you, but as something you are inside of, something that is inside you, a closed system in which your breath and the recycled air are no longer separate, in which the walls no longer surround you, but pass through you, in which the schedule is no longer enforced, but lived, not as obedience, but as metabolism. And you find that thinking, real thinking, the kind that once brought questions and conclusions and choices, has eroded into something quieter, something gentler, like the way sediment moves at the bottom of a deep lake, stirred not by current or storm, but by slow shifts in pressure. And now your thoughts come not in sentences but in textures, not in ideas but in vague impressions. And you begin to measure your internal landscape not by clarity, but by consistency. How long you can sit with your palms flat and your eyes half closed before the first twitch of restlessness returns. How long you can chew without wondering what it is you are eating. How long you can lie in the cot without remembering the word bed. And you realize that the cell has become not your prison but your habitat. That what was once constraint is now condition. That what was once limitation is now law. And you begin to move through it with the same instinctive grace as an animal in its biome, turning with practiced economy, sitting with the familiarity of ritual, stretching your back against the frame of the bed not for relief, but because the motion itself is inscribed in you like the opening of a prayer, and in this prayer, you are both the reciter and the listener, and there is no God to receive it, only the ceiling, only the fluorescent flicker, only the mechanical breath of the vent. And the days, if you can still use that word, begin to loop not horizontally, one after another, but vertically, like descending levels of a spiral. And each return to morning, each arrival at stillness, each resumption of motion, feels not like the repetition of the same moment, but the deepening of it. The way a well deepens not by widening but by sinking, by going further and further until light becomes suggestion, and suggestion becomes silence, and silence becomes the only atmosphere left in which thought can still float without bursting. And sometimes in the softest hours when you are most dissolved, when your breath no longer feels like air but like rhythm, when your body is no longer weight but shape, you begin to wonder, not urgently, not sharply, but with a kind of drifting fascination, whether this is what death will feel like, not darkness or ending, but the same slow merging into quiet sameness, the same loss of edge, the same surrender of self into system, and you do not fear it, you do not long for it. You simply acknowledge that if death is silence, and if silence is what you now inhabit, then perhaps you have already touched its outermost wall and been permitted to pass through, not to the other side, but deeper into this side, the side of routine and stillness and invisible design. And in that realization, you stop watching for escape, not because it is impossible, but because it is irrelevant, because escape would mean rupture, would mean volume, would mean difference, and difference would mean pain, and pain would mean remembering that something else once existed. And you have come too far down the spiral now, too far into the stillness to wish for pain. And so you close your eyes once more, not to sleep, but to return. And the return itself is perfect because it is always the same, always reliable, always unchanging. And the silence welcomes you again, not as a stranger, not as a prisoner, but as one of its own. And as you remain in that silence, not just enveloped by it, but composed of it, made from it in the way a statue is made from stone, shaped by the gradual chisel of countless repeated motions, each one carving away some excess of personality, some ornamental detail of individuality, until what remains is not a copy of what was, but a refined, distilled essence of being without variance, without conflict, without name, You begin to understand that what you once called thought is now atmosphere, that consciousness has stretched so wide and thinned so gently that you no longer think in lines but in gradients, not in arguments but in waves. And these waves do not crash but fold, do not ripple but settle, until all that remains are subtle rises and dips in the calm surface of what you once insisted was you. And you begin to accept that nothing changes not because change is forbidden, but because it is unnecessary, because the structure works, and what works does not need to shift. And your place in that structure, this narrow bed, this tray of food, this scheduled motion and stillness, is not cruel but precise, and precision is the last comfort left to you. The final form of understanding, the cleanest truth, that in a world where nothing is asked of you except stillness, the greatest clarity comes not from thought, not from memory, but from rhythm, from being where you are, exactly as you are, at all times. The tray arrives again, perhaps the 4th time today, perhaps the 15th, perhaps the 1000th since the beginning, and you receive it not with anticipation and not with dread, but with the same posture you have always adopted. Both hands open, elbows slightly bent, gaze downward but aware. And you do not even look at what is on the tray. You simply begin the motions. Because these motions are now prayers, each chew an invocation, each swallow a vow. And by the time you place the fork back down, you have not tasted, you have not judged, you have simply completed, and completion, in this place, is not a step toward anything but the end of motion itself. And when the tray is removed, when your fingers rest again on your knees, when your eyes lift to meet the blankness of the wall opposite, you do not sigh, you do not lean, you do not shift weight from one hip to the other, you simply hold. And holding becomes a posture of thought, a position of reflection without content, a vessel that does not need to be filled because its emptiness is pure. And this purity is not a virtue, but a condition. And this condition is not sadness, but stillness. And stillness is the closest you have come in weeks, perhaps months, perhaps years, to peace. The light does not change, the walls do not breathe, the bed does not soften, and you remain. Not because you must, not because you cannot leave, but because there is nowhere else to be. And in that knowledge, that absolute absence of need, of desire, of narrative, you'll feel yourself dissolve again. Not into fear, not into numbness, but into shape, into silence, into something smaller and more permanent than self, and more complete than escape. You wake without knowing you've woken, not because there was a sound, not because there was movement, but because something deep inside the rhythm of your own body recognizes that this is the moment, not marked by time or light or routine, but by the internal pulse that has taken the place of clocks. And when you open your eyes, the ceiling is already waiting. That same chalk-white expanse that neither looms nor fades, just hangs there like the lid of something that was never meant to be opened. You don't blink right away. There's no need. Your eyes adjust instantly because the light has never changed, because the brightness is always the same temperature, same tone, same artificial flatness that erases shadow and warmth and replaces them with pure visibility. A kind of antiseptic presence that tells you you are seen, even when no one is looking. You stay lying down for a while, not because you're tired, but because there's no signal to rise except the feeling, somewhere between your lungs and your gut, that it's time to move again. Not out of necessity, not out of urgency, but out of alignment with a cycle that doesn't begin or end but flows like a closed river, looping endlessly within a container that is both your room and your body. When you sit up, the motion is slow, not from hesitation, but from precision, and your feet find the floor without looking. Bare skin, meeting cold concrete that feels the same every time, dry, hard, slightly powdery, like stone that has forgotten its origin. You pause there, hands resting on your thighs, and you feel the silence in the room not just as an absence of sound, but as a shape, as a pressure, like a soft weight pressing in from every direction, thickening the air in your ears, wrapping itself gently around your jaw, and you breathe through it carefully, as though breathing too sharply might cause it to break. There's no mirror, but you don't need one. You know what you look like, not in detail, not as an image, but as sensation. The weight of your limbs, the stretch of your skin, the ache behind your knees, the way your eyelids blink in perfect time with the slow turning of your thoughts. You wait, because waiting is part of the shape of the day. And when the door opens, it does so without surprise, without warning. Just a quiet release of mechanical breath as the seal breaks and the hallway outside becomes real again. And the guard is there. Or at least the shape of a guard. No words, no face. You look at just the angle of an arm pointing where you already knew you were going. You walk. Not fast, not slow, just with the weight of someone who has walked this hallway too many times for it to be called movement. The light here is the same, but colder. The air smells of cleaning solution and metal, but not freshly cleaned. More like these smells have soaked into the very walls, into the floor, into your own sweat. You pass others, not close, not in formation, just existing near you. Other bodies moving in silence, eyes low, shoulders slightly forward, not in shame, not in fear, just in rhythm, like branches swaying in the same invisible wind. No one speaks. Not because it's forbidden, but because there's nothing to say. Because language has no traction here. Because the moment you try to put this experience into words, it begins to dissolve. Because this isn't something you describe. It's something you survive. There is no signal that night has begun, not in the way you once understood night. No setting sun, no dimming of streetlights, no hush of evening sounds beyond windows. Only the slow and subtle dimming of the overhead light, just a shade lower in brightness, just enough to shift the color of the walls from chalk to lead, to suggest that it is now time to rest, though nothing has changed except your internal permission to stop moving. You lie down without resistance, not because you are tired, but because the motion is expected, the same way your heart continues to beat, not because it chooses to, but because it must. And when your back meets the cot, it does so with the gentle resignation of someone returning to the shape of stillness carved over countless nights. A stillness so familiar it no longer feels like an action, but a resting place inside your bones. The room grows quieter, though you didn't think that was possible. Quieter than silence. As if the very molecules in the air have agreed to stop vibrating. As if the sound of your own blood has been muffled under layers of soft pressing thought. You begin to hear things. Not sounds from outside, not footsteps or voices, but internal echoes. Breath that isn't quite yours. A name that doesn't belong to anyone you know. A phrase you don't remember hearing, but it loops now, over and over, in the back of your mind like an old radio transmission, repeating through static. Your eyes stay open. Not because you can't sleep, but because they no longer need to close. Because in this light, this dim gray-blue hush, there's nothing to shut out. You stare at the ceiling and try to find the exact point where it meets the wall, and as you do, you begin to wonder if it ever did, if there is even a ceiling anymore, or if the shadows have simply stretched too far upward and swallowed it whole. And your thoughts begin to shift, not like a river, but like fog rolling across the inside of your skull. Soft, slow, without direction, without urgency. They rise and fall. Memories come, but not in order, not even with clarity, just fragments. The sound of a door closing in another life, the way gravel feels under bare feet, a smell that once made you smile, but now has no name, the sensation of someone's breath on your neck, real or imagined. And you hold these fragments like pieces of broken glass, sharp, glinting, useless, and you do not try to assemble them, you just let them be. Your body does not hurt, but it is full of weight, as if you are made not of muscle or bone, but of something denser, concrete poured into a human shape, then left to dry too long under a pale light. And your chest rises and falls, not from sleep, not from dreaming, but because your lungs remember what to do, even when the rest of you has forgotten. Your breath slows into that shallow rhythm that exists just above unconsciousness, that state where the body prepares to let go but the mind remains tethered, reluctant, suspended in the glow of something like sleep, but not quite, because this place does not allow full surrender. Not because it forbids it, but because it simply offers no true darkness, no real quiet, only a half-emptiness where the night is not night but the pause between repetitions. You lie on your back, arms loose at your sides, fingertips touching the edge of the mattress where the seams have begun to fray, and you count the threads there without realizing, not with numbers, but with your skin, with the soft repetition of texture against the pad of your fingers. And that touch becomes the most alive part of you in this moment, becomes the anchor keeping your thoughts from sliding too far into the fog. Somewhere far above, in ducts you cannot see, the air system lets out a slow, whirring sigh, and for a brief second you imagine it breathing, not as machinery but as an animal, massive and unseen, slumbering somewhere behind the walls. And your mind offers you images without asking, without permission. Eyes in the dark, soft blinking lights that follow you like stars, a figure sitting quietly on the end of your bed, not moving, not speaking, just watching. A shape your body believes in even as your mind denies it. You blink, but you don't remember when the last one was. The light, dim, sickly, unmoving, does not give you any sense of time passing. There is no moon. There is no clock. There is only your heartbeat, faint and deliberate like a hand knocking on a locked door from the inside. Your mouth is dry. Your tongue rests flat. You can still taste the metal of the sink water, and you're not sure if it's from today or from every day, because every swallow tastes the same now, like nothing, like routine turned into liquid. Your thoughts drift again, this time to the floor beside your bed, to the small, perfect square of space where your foot always lands when you rise, to the scuff in the paint near the lower corner of the wall that reminds you, somehow, of a crack in a window you saw once long ago, or maybe only dreamed. And you fixate on that mark, on its shape, on whether it has changed, whether it's deeper, whether someone else sees it, or whether it was made just for you, to keep you connected to some tiny truth the walls haven't yet erased. Your ears begin to search, not for voices, you know there won't be any, but for the tiniest variations, the tick of the bed frame when you shift your weight, the far-off hiss of plumbing, the faint rattle of metal as someone 3 cells away turns in their sleep, and suddenly the world feels very close, even though it is still utterly unreachable. And you begin to speak, but only in your mind. You say things like, I am still here, and this is still real, and don't forget. Though you're no longer sure what it is you're trying not to forget, whether it's a face or a sound, or just the fact that you are someone, that you existed somewhere else, some other time, in sunlight, in motion, in warmth. The bed creaks under your hips when you shift, not a loud sound, but it echoes like thunder in your skull. Everything echoes now, even silence, especially silence. You turn your head slowly, resting your cheek against the coolness of the wall, and for a moment, just a moment, you close your eyes not to sleep, but to fall inward, deeper. Past the room, past the routine, into that other place you've been building, that quiet space inside where the walls don't reach, where the lights don't hum, where the door never opens. And for a breath, maybe 2, you almost believe you are there. Your eyelids stay closed longer now, not because sleep has taken hold, but because the world behind them is softer, less defined, more fluid. And in that loosened space, you begin to drift, not away from the cell, but deeper into it, as if the room is not a space you occupy, but a sea you sink into. And the deeper you go, the less you feel the edges of your own body, the less your thoughts arrive as words. The more they come as textures, as warmth and weight and thin, shifting lines of sensation across your skin like fingers that aren't there, like wind that does not move. Your legs stretch slowly, and the motion feels strange, exaggerated, as though they belong to someone else, or as though you are remembering how to stretch them from a time when it mattered. The cot shifts beneath your calves, the metal support beneath the thin mattress groaning just slightly, and that sound becomes a landmark in the dark, something you fix yourself to as if it were a firelight in a long hallway, a confirmation that you are still here, still tethered. And yet, some part of you isn't. Some part of you has floated beyond the cot, through the wall, through the slow humming air ducts, through the cameras that blink without watching, through the rows of other identical cells lined up like sealed thoughts inside a brain too large to name, and into a space that no longer observes you, but remembers you. A hollow, echoing space where all the motions of the day exist at once, layered, overlapping, every tray lifted, every step taken, every glance downward in the hallway, all stacked upon each other like thin, translucent sheets of memory. And in that place, voices begin to return. Not the guards, not other prisoners, but voices from another life, softer, frayed around the edges, muffled by time. And they don't say much, nothing profound, only your name, spoken the way it used to be spoken, the way someone might call you from across a room at sunset, the way someone might say it under their breath while waiting beside you for the rain to stop. And that sound, that single syllable, is more dangerous than any silence because it almost opens a door. You feel it. You feel your chest tighten just slightly, your jaw clench, not in pain, not in fear, but in memory, in recognition. And for a moment you want to follow the voice, to lean into it, to let it carry you up and out of this place, but something inside resists, gently, firmly, and reminds you that this space, this cold, quiet, predictable space, is safer now than the memory of what came before. You take a breath through your nose. It's shallow, filtered, dry. You taste metal again. Not sharp, not blood. Just the sterile, preserved flavor of air that's been measured and cleaned too many times. Your tongue presses to the roof of your mouth as if checking whether it still fits. And it does, barely. And your lips part just slightly, but no sound comes out. Because sound would require effort, and effort would imply hope, and hope is a luxury you can no longer afford at night. The ceiling doesn't move. The vent doesn't change. But you begin to sense a shift in the rhythm, not in the room, but inside you. A lowering, a thickening. The soft weight of fatigue not pulling you down, but pushing in on all sides as though your thoughts are being folded slowly into smaller, tighter shapes, prepared for storage, compressed for efficiency. Your arms lie heavy at your sides. Your heels dig gently into the mattress. Your breath no longer rises, it just rests. There is no fear, no tension. Only the slow, soft hum of the room continuing around you, above you, within you. You are still. You are silent. You are night. You lie there, still, unmoving. Not because you are restrained or held or locked in place, but because your body has learned over time that stillness is not simply the absence of motion, but the most complete form of participation. The final, perfect answer to the question this room has always been asking you, with its square shape, with its smooth walls, with its endless silence that no longer demands but simply receives. And in this perfect receiving, you feel your presence sink beneath the surface of thought like a stone slowly lowering into deep water. No splash, no sound, only descent, steady and slow and final. There is no more counting of breaths, because each breath now arrives without need for witness, as though your lungs are no longer part of your body but part of the room, breathing on its behalf, and the air, dry, recycled, scrubbed of scent and texture, no longer enters with effort, but settles inside you the way dust settles in quiet corners. Gradually, invisibly, until it is simply part of you, until you can no longer tell where you end and the stillness begins. The ceiling above is no longer visible, not because your eyes are closed, but because what your eyes offer has become irrelevant. You no longer look at things to understand them. You no longer search the corners of the room for meaning or difference or evidence of time passing, because time, here, has done something you never thought possible. It has stopped needing to be noticed. And in that unnoticed state, it has stretched so thin across the hours that it no longer separates you from anything. It only holds you like a silk thread strung between breath and breath. Your arms lie heavy at your sides, but not in fatigue. In peace, in certainty, in surrender to the fact that no more movement is required, no more decisions, no more compliance or defiance, only the final alignment with the rhythm of this place. And even the rhythm itself has slowed, has lowered its voice to a hum so deep that you don't hear it anymore. You simply feel it in your bones, like the residual warmth left by a fire long extinguished, but never forgotten by the stone floor beneath it. No dreams rise, no memories interrupt. Even the images that once flickered behind your eyelids, the faces, the voices, the old coloring, have receded into the farthest corners of your mind. Not erased, but quieted, like children who have finally fallen asleep in another room, and what remains is only now. Only this breath, this surface beneath your shoulder blades, this air moving across the ridge of your upper lip, this quiet that is no longer silence but atmosphere, a presence more consistent than sound. You feel the weight of your own existence lessen, not in pain, not in fear, but in the way that heavy snow covers a landscape slowly, softly, without announcement, until the shapes beneath it no longer matter, until there is only one surface, white and still and whole. And as you remain there, breathing that last unmeasured breath, thinking that last unfinished thought, hearing that last echo of your own presence dissolve into the walls that have known you longer than any mirror, you understand that this moment, this surrender, this weightless floating within perfect stillness, is not the end of something. It is the becoming of everything. Good night.